Good evening, peoples. I am Pastor Leia, and this is my friend Gingersnap here, who has very much missed doing live streams with me. So welcome back to our living room as we return to our Tuesday night Bible study series. I guess definitionally we might get a bit fuzzier tonight, but anyway. So tonight I wanted to talk about a story that kind of is in the Bible, but also kind of isn't. But it's a good story. So it is a piece of apocryphal literature. So apocryphal in usual normal English tends to mean of dubious origins, like this may or may not have happened. There's all sorts of apocryphal stories about George Washington, etc. And there's no reason to think that they actually happened, but they're still keep getting told. Anyway, so apocryphal literally means hidden from Greek, and it can mean some different things. So there's a bunch of books in the Bible. Of course, I say the Bible, but depending on what kind of tradition you're in, the books in the Bible might be different. So in the Protestant tradition, there are a dozen or so books or sections of books that are not usually in our Bible, but are in a Catholic Bible or an Orthodox Bible, which gets interesting. So those books that are in some Bibles and not others are called Deuterocanonical, or the Deuterocanon, which I'm probably going to be throwing out a lot of big words anyway. Books in between. Anyway, they're kind of contested. So usually the reason why they're in and not in the apocryphal parts of the Bible were usually written around 200 to 400 AD. So definitely post-Jesus, and would have been very recent at the point when the books of the Bible were decided in 382, or was it 392? Anyway, the 3-something, near 400, the Council of Rome. So these would have been very recent writings. Very interestingly, Jesus and Paul, throughout the New Testament, there are a lot of references to stories or characters in the Hebrew Bible. Nothing in the apocryphal stories are ever mentioned, so they're not referenced in the New Testament. They're also not considered Jewish scripture. In some cases, they might give us some interesting historical information about something that happened, or at least how people thought about certain things at a point in history, but they're not necessarily on the same level as, the Gospel of Matthew or whatever. So they get disputed. So there were chunks that Luther wanted to take out, Martin Luther, in the 16th century. I think I've read one reason why some parts were taken out was because that made it cheaper to print Bibles, but it's not that much text, so I don't think it would save you that many pages. I don't know. This is not necessarily my area of history. But anyway, so some Bibles will have these books and stories, and others will not. So there's also another kind of disputed writing, the pseudepigraphia, which we'll get into another time, I think. They get complicated. So there are 3 chunks that are or are not in the book of Daniel. And so I wanted to look at one of them tonight, which I think is a great story. So the story of Susanna and the elders, very interestingly, is the first recorded detective story in all of literature, which is pretty fun. It's kind of the origin story of Daniel, but again, it was written later than the rest of it, so it's a very fun story, but maybe shouldn't be counted in the rest of the book. Anyway, so I wanted to read the story of Susanna. If you've got something like a study Bible like this one, it might have the Apocrypha. If it's a smaller Bible, the kind that you could maybe fit in a purse, it might not be in there. or it depends where you bought it, or you can just Google it. Anyway, so, story of Susanna. Once upon a time, as all stories should begin. There was a man living in Babylon whose name was Joachim. He married the daughter of Hilkiah named Susanna, a very beautiful woman and one who feared the Lord. So it goes on to say that her parents were very faithful, and Joachim is very rich. He's got a nice house with like big, pretty gardens. And because he's rich and important in the community, the elders and like the judges and the leaders will spend a lot of time at his house talking with him. So, let's see. When the people left at noon, the people meeting with Joachim, Susanna's husband, Susanna would go into her husband's garden to walk. Every day, the two elders used to see her, going in and walking about, and they began to lust for her. They suppressed their consciences and turned away their eyes from looking to heaven or remembering their duty to administer justice. Creeper's gonna creep. Both were overwhelmed with passion for her, but they did not tell each other of their distress, for they were ashamed to disclose their lustful desire to seduce her, as they should have been. Day after day, they watched eagerly to see her. One day, they said to each other, let us go home, for it's time for lunch. So they both left and parted from each other. But turning back, they met again, and when each pressed the other for the reason, they confessed their lust. Then they together arranged for a time when they could find her alone. So these two sneaky creeps both say, oh, I'm going to go home for lunch now. And they sort of walk off, and they circle back because they're going to creep on Susanna, and they realize that both of them are doing the same thing because they're both creeps. Once, while they were watching for an opportune day, Susanna went in as before with only 2 maids, and wished to bathe in the garden, for it was a hot day. No one was there except the 2 elders, who had hidden themselves and were watching her. She said to her maids, "Bring me olive oil and ointments, and shut the garden doors so that I can bathe." They did as she told them. They shut the doors of the garden and went out by the side doors to bring what they had been commanded. They did not see the elders, because they were hiding. When the maids had gone out, the 2 elders got up and ran to her. They said, "Look, the garden doors are shut, and no one can see us. We are burning with desire for you, so give your consent and lie with us. If you refuse, we will testify against you that a young man was with you, and this was why you sent your maids away." So the deal is, have sex with us, or we're going to lie and say you were committing adultery, which will be a death sentence in our society. Not great options. Did I mention that these guys are jerks and creeps? Susanna groaned and said, "I am completely trapped. For if I do this, it will mean death for me. If I do not, I cannot escape your hands. I choose not to do it. I will fall into your hands rather than sin in the sight of the Lord." So she is willingly choosing the option that might very well have her be executed because she doesn't want to lie in front of God. Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice, and the 2 elders shouted against her. And one of them ran and opened the garden doors. When the people in the house heard the shouting in the garden, they rushed in at the side door to see what had happened to her. And when the elders told their story, the servants felt very much ashamed, for nothing like this had ever been said about Susanna. Which, maybe should be something that they should consider. She's never been accused of being unfaithful or unrighteous. So it's very bizarre that she's suddenly being accused of this. So the next day, everyone's back at the house, and the elders are telling everybody what Susanna did. And they're all horrified, and so her parents are there, and the whole community. Now, Susanna was a woman of great refinement and beautiful in appearance. This is the second time that the author has told us that she's beautiful, which is interesting. As she was veiled, the scoundrels ordered her to be unveiled, so that they might feast their eyes on her beauty. Those who were with her and all who saw her were weeping. Then the 2 elders stood up before the people and laid their hands on her head. Through her tears she looked up toward heaven, for her heart trusted in the Lord. The elders said, "While we were walking in the garden alone, this woman came in with 2 maids, shut the garden doors, and dismissed the maids. Then a young man who was hiding there came to her and lay with her. We were in a corner of the garden, and when we saw this wickedness, we ran to them. Although we saw them embracing, we could not hold the man, because he was stronger than we. And he opened the doors and got away. We did, however, seize this woman and asked who the young man was, but she would not tell us. These things we testify." Because they were elders of the people and the judges, the assembly believed them and condemned Susanna to death. Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice and said, "O eternal God, you know what is secret, and are aware of all things before they come to be. You know that these men have given false evidence against me, and now I am to die, though I have done none of the wicked things that they have charged against me." The Lord heard her cry. Just as she was being led off to execution, God stirred up the Holy Spirit of a young lad named Daniel, and he shouted with a loud voice, "I want no part in shedding this woman's blood." This is such a great story. So now Daniel says, "Okay, we've heard the elders testify against Susanna, but I want to talk to them separately, not at the same time, so they can't corroborate their story." So he asks the first elder, "Can you give me some more detail? What tree was the young man hiding behind? Under what tree were they having sex?" And so the first man says, "Oh, under this tree." But then when he goes and talks to the other elder, he says, "Oh, it was under that tree." And so clearly, this is an event that supposedly they saw happen the day before. And supposedly they rushed in and tried to arrest both people and were like right there. And you'd think that they would know what tree this event allegedly happened under, but they disagree. And so clearly they're lying because their stories don't match up. So Daniel comes back to the crowd and is like, "Okay, these guys are lying. This is how I know this. We should not be condemning Susanna." So then the whole assembly raised a great shout and blessed God, who saves those who hope in the Lord. And they took action against the 2 elders, because out of their own mouths Daniel had convicted them of bearing false witness. They did to them as they had wickedly planned to do to their neighbor. So they're put to death instead of Susanna, which, it's kind of justice. We don't always get that in this world. It's nice to read about it. Let's see. Acting in accordance with the law of Moses, they put them to death. Thus, innocent blood was spared that day. Hilkiah and his wife praised God for their daughter Susanna, and so did her husband Joachim and all her relatives, because she was found innocent of a shameful deed. And from that day onward, Daniel had a great reputation among the people. And they all lived happily ever after. So this is a great story. I think I mentioned before that when it takes several centuries for a piece of history to be recorded about, several centuries ago, it's probably a later invention and not something that happened at the time. There's a lot of urban legend type things that only get written about much later. And so we know that they didn't actually happen historically. Gosh, it is really raining. Huh, okay. Clearly not the beautiful hot day to be bathing outside like in tonight's story. So this is probably, more like fan fiction is a term that I like to use for some of these things. it definitely, it's not the sort of thing that Daniel wouldn't have done, but it probably didn't happen in the way that the story tells it. So it's still a fun story to tell. It definitely still has a great message of tell the truth even when that might be dangerous, because righteousness is important, and God values honesty. Also, maybe don't be a total creep and spy on a woman who's bathing and then try to blackmail her into having sex with you. Like, that's also an important lesson. Hopefully you didn't need to learn that lesson. You could have drawn that conclusion yourself. Anyway, so some of the apocryphal books do occasionally show up as an option in the lectionary. On those days, there's an additional Hebrew Bible lesson as well. So let's see, I think I might have chosen a chunk of Sirach once as a secondary reading. But for the most part, I haven't really had the opportunity to do much with these texts or stories. But they are interesting to look at. So I thought we might look at some apocryphal things for a bit, perhaps this month. So anyway, as I did announce last week, I have ended our Wednesday evening prayers for now. They might come back around Advent. We shall see. Stay tuned. We are still having our Thursday afternoon Zooms at 5 for our informal conversation, cocktail or not. It's great when people bring their pets so that I can appreciate that pets are great. So now to annoy the cat, pull her up from the electric blanket. Good night. You gonna meow? Oh, I thought you were gonna meow. Okay, fine. No, just small annoying noises. So until next time, peoples, be honest in the eyes of God.